Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special edition of the J&R podcast. My name is Jade Tran, and I am joined today with my co-host, Ruben Lopez, as we do a deep dive into one of the most important events in modern U.S. history, and that is the War on Drugs.
Thanks for having me, Jade. It's a pleasure to be here. The war on drugs is a very well-known era in time, especially for us criminal justice majors. And although it's talked about and we hear about it all the time, the word war on drugs gets thrown around so much, right? But we should establish exactly what the war on drugs was, what happened, and I think you should do that for us, yeah?
Right, and thank you. So, the War on Drugs was designed ostensibly to stop drug use and drug dealing across the United States, which was declared by President Richard Nixon in 1971. But, as you and most of us are aware, what ended up happening is that it entangled millions of ethnic minorities in the criminal justice system for generations, and in particular, the Black and Hispanic communities. For some, this was an adverse consequence of a well-intentioned policy, but for others, this was exactly what they wanted the policy to do. During this time period of the War on Drugs, mandatory sentencing laws established harsher punishments for possession of crack cocaine compared to powder cocaine, resulting in significantly longer prison sentences for Black individuals, as it is primarily used in urban Black communities. This disparity was highlighted by the fact that possession of a small amount of crack was the same mandatory penalty as a much larger amount of powder cocaine, when powder is primarily used by middle to upper class whites. Congress would eventually vote to reduce the sentencing ratio for crack cocaine to powder cocaine from 100-1 to 18-1.
Yeah, you make a really good point, Jade. Aggressive law enforcement practices such as harsh sentencing for drug offenses targeted primarily people of color, right? So this led to the over-incarceration of fathers. This led to families being torn apart, right? Families became dysfunctional, and many other effects, but we'll get into that in this segment.
I'm not sure if you're aware, but the recidivism rate in the United States is at an all-time high right now. Especially among Black and Hispanic males, they are seen as continuing to go into the system repeatedly and repeatedly. In the prison system, there is a lack of resources for these individuals to gain life experiences. So, when they are inevitably released from prison, they are released into a world where they do not know how to find jobs, where they do not know where to find food, where they do not know how to contact their families and their old friends. And therefore, more likely than not, they will return back to a life of crime.
Very much aware about recidivism, right? And I would argue that recidivism started during the war on drugs, right? So when people of color were sentenced harshly, right, they would spend time in jail. But what would they do in jail and prison? Would they learn how to gain an education? Would they learn how to gain a valuable skill or trade to take back into the community? No, they would not. They would learn how to commit crime. And when they did, they would take it back into the community, right, and commit more crime. And if that were not the case, they were still labeled as convicts, right? So imagine this. You're applying to a job, right? And in your application, you've put that you've been convicted of a crime. Do you think the employer is going to want to hire you? No, they're not. You're not going to have a source of income. You're not going to have a source of work, right? You're not going to have employment, right? So how are you going to make money? How are you going to support your family? So you're going to do what you know what to do, commit crime. And that's how you're going to make money. You're going to commit crime and make money. And that cycle never ends. The reason why we're having this conversation isn't to give you guys a history lesson on the war on drugs. It's because of the rhetoric surrounded by being a disadvantaged individual. Before I get into that, I want to give a personal story. So I grew up in a disadvantaged neighborhood. I grew up in South LA. Growing up, I was surrounded by gang violence, right? I was surrounded by just crime, you know? It was scary for me to live there. So what my mom did, she sent me to school in more privileged communities, right? Throughout my whole life, from all the way from kinder all the way to high school, right? Growing up with more privileged individuals, you would always hear negative remarks and negative rhetoric saying, yeah, where you live, it's ghetto, you know, it's dangerous. They're up to no good. You guys are just like, aren't going to amount to anything, you know, just negative things, right? And of course, I would accept that, you know, not think too much of it. I would believe that my community is the way it is because they want to be that way. But that's an ignorant way of thinking, because if you stop and think, my community is the way it is. And when you stop and think, you realize that we're placed in disadvantaged circumstances because of our predecessors, right? The previous government policies, right? That caused so much harm and led to so much disorganization, right? In society.
I think you and I can relate well on our communities and how we can see that they are disadvantaged in comparison to more affluent communities, because I personally grew up in a community that looked like me and talked like me. So I was not exposed very much to other people of color and other races very much. And even within my community of Asian Americans, there was a stigma that we would see from Black and Hispanic communities. And I do not think that that is a coincidence. Within the U.S. history, that is what we have seen, because the Black communities, they have been subjected to slavery. They have been subjected to racial discrimination almost all of their lives, right?
Mostly, I don't want to say it's mostly due to their history. I want to say it's mostly due to the way they're labeled by, I guess, the media, by film industry, by society, by the news. They're labeled as criminals, and that's exactly what happened during this period. African Americans and Hispanics were labeled as criminals, and why do you think they were sentenced to so many harsh terms? Why do you think they were the only ones being targeted by the war on drugs? If everyone is against a minority, of course everyone is going to believe that it's true. That's why this negative stigma, this negative view, this negative outlook, this negative rhetoric is painted on communities of color.
I'm not sure if you're aware, but the recidivism rate in the United States is at an all-time high right now. Especially among Black and Hispanic males, they are seen as continuing to go into the system repeatedly and repeatedly. In the prison system, there is a lack of resources for these individuals to gain life experiences. So when they are inevitably released from prison, they are released into a world where they do not know how to find jobs, where they do not know where to find food, where they do not know how to contact their families and their old friends. And therefore, more likely than not, they will return back to a life of crime.
Very much aware about recidivism, right? And I would argue that recidivism started during the war on drugs. So when people of color were sentenced harshly, they would spend time in jail. But what would they do in jail and prison? Would they learn how to gain an education? Would they learn how to gain a valuable skill or trade to take back into the community? No, they would not. They would learn how to commit crime. And when they did, they would take it back into the community and commit more crime. If that were not the case, they were still labeled as convicts. Imagine this. You're applying to a job, and in your application, you've put that you've been convicted of a crime. Do you think the employer is going to want to hire you? No, they're not. You're not going to have a source of income. You're not going to have a source of work, right? You're not going to have employment. How are you going to make money? How are you going to support your family? So you're going to do what you know what to do. You're going to commit crime and make money, and that cycle never ends. And what do you think happens to the families that are affected by incarcerated individuals? If a father is incarcerated, right, it's just a single mother and her kids. How is a mother going to go forward? How is a mother going to make a living? Not having that support from the father, right? It's going to be much harder. And I'm saying it's impossible. It's going to be much harder. When the father isn't there, the kids are going to have less supervision, right? They're going to be able to do what they want. They're going to hang out with a group of kids they're not supposed to, right? And then they themselves are going to learn crime and criminal habits. If the father does end up going back into the community, right, they're going to learn what their father does. That's what they're learning, right, from a young age. So if they're getting used to crime from a young age, they're going to adopt that into their behavior, right? And the cycle continues, right? It's not just the father, it's also the son or the daughters. So that cycle of crime is, you could say, inherited.
You're absolutely right. And while we are on this topic, I might as well mention the nuclear family model. The nuclear family model can be seen as controversial, but it has been proven by statistics that a nuclear family that consists of two parents, with the original model, a mother and a father, and their biological children, all living together in a single household. Most children that come out of a very functional nuclear family with both parents in their lives have statistically seen a very good quality of life.
I totally agree. I wouldn't say being part of a nuclear family is the way to go or the only way to live, but it would be wrong for me to say that it doesn't have any negative effects not being in a nuclear family. So we have to acknowledge the facts, right? It's been shown that you're more likely to commit a crime if you don't live in a nuclear family and a father or a mother is not in the picture. It is more likely for you to commit crime. I feel like it's a very appropriate time to tie in criminology, applying our own knowledge into this subject. For instance, let's talk about criminological theories. The reason why people commit crimes, right? Let's take, for instance, one of the easiest theories, right? Rational choice theory. Rational choice theory is a cost-benefit analysis. You weigh the costs and the benefits. Basically, the costs are like the risk of being caught or the punishment. The benefits could be like financial gain or pleasure, right? So when you engage in that cost-benefit analysis, you think to yourself, if the benefits are higher than the costs, of course I'm gonna be more inclined to commit crime. And if the costs are higher than the benefits, I'm not gonna want to commit the crime, right? So let's take a scenario, for example. Let's take a single mother of 3 children. She barely makes a living. Let's say, for instance, she doesn't have work for a month or 2. Let's say, for instance, her children are hungry. They haven't ate for like 2 days. And she hasn't made money, but she has to feed her kids. She's going to be put in a position where she wants to steal food from, let's say, for instance, a grocery store, right, to feed her children. The benefits of stealing from the grocery store are going to be way higher than the cost, right? So let's talk about another theory, for instance, social disorganization theory.
Yeah, and you make a very good point. The social disorganization theory itself establishes that crime and deviance are actually more prevalent in communities where social institutions are weak. As we have established, the social institutions that are weak are urban, Hispanic, and Black communities.
And I would like to add another theory. Let's take social learning theory. This theory states that individuals learn through observing others' behaviors, right? And that they model their behavior. In the context of an incarcerated individual, when they're placed in a prison cell, they're surrounded by people who commit crime. And oftentimes, the way to make it through prison is by becoming a criminal, right? And so when you learn this behavior of being a criminal, this criminogenic behavior, and you're in prison for quite a bit of time, this behavior is reinforced, right? It's ingrained in you. And when you come out of prison, you just take that into the community and you take that crime and you commit crime in the community.
These theories perfectly explain how these families were disrupted and economic challenges were heightened. Therefore, the adoption of criminogenic behaviors increased, therein creating a cycle of crime and incarceration for generations to come.
Now that we've pointed out the effects, right, the harm done by the war on drugs and the policies, the effects of it, it's best that we suggest reform. It's best we shift our mind in the policy. And instead of having a system that emphasizes punishment that hasn't been proven to work, right, has only been showing harmful effects, as we mentioned, recidivism, right, the dysfunction of communities, breaking down communities, right? So there hasn't been any good from having this attitude and our criminal justice system, right? I think we should take more of a rehabilitative approach. And Jade here is going to tell us ways in which we can reform the system.
There can be more support when it comes to re-entry programs. We can develop policies that encourage employers to hire individuals with criminal records and provide incentives for their reintegration into the workforce, which would massively reduce recidivism rates and address the barriers to housing for these people as well. We could also implement comprehensive data collection on arrests, sentencing, and incarceration. We can provide support to wives, husbands, to kids that have family that are incarcerated, and to make sure that they have the support they need in order to have a better quality of life.
And yeah, there's quite a bit of literature and evidence, right, supporting the idea of investing in educational programs. This idea of investing in educational programs not only reduces recidivism, but it also reduces the amount of taxpayer dollars that has to be spent. A recent report by the Rand Corporation found that for every $1 investment in prison education programs, there is a $4 to $5 reduction in incarceration costs during the first 3 years post-release of a prisoner. So instead of using our taxpayer dollars on spending it on incarcerating an individual, right, that money is saved. Not only that, an individual becomes reformed, a contributor to society, right, and not just repeating offender.
With all of that being said, thank you so much for joining us on the special edition episode of the J and R podcast. The war on drugs is an event that has left a lasting mark on our society, and it's our responsibility to confront these issues head on. We hope this discussion encourages reflection, empathy, and most importantly, action. Together, we can break the chains of systemic racism and work towards a more just and equitable future. Until next time, continue the conversation, stay informed, and let's strive for a society that dismantles these harmful legacies. Thank you for listening.